I welcome you to the third panel of this conference, which is devoted to Ibn Gabirol's philosophy. Our first speaker is Tanya Vartman of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Tanya specializes in medieval Jewish philosophy and mysticism in the context of Islamic philosophy, and against the background of ancient Greek thought. Today, she will address the question, was Ibn Gabirol a pseudo-Empedoclean philosopher?
Should I finish that now?
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm really very happy to be here, and I would like to thank the organizers of the conference who actually enabled us to gather here and to celebrate Ibn Gabirol's anniversary. Ibn Gabirol, who is, for me personally, one of the main thinkers, whom I've been studying for several years, and I continue doing this, and I continue rather asking questions than giving answers. So this is why also the title of my lecture is was Ibn Gabirol a Pseudo-Empedoclean philosopher? Ibn Gabirol's a remarkable concept of the supreme couple of principles, universal matter and universal form, complicates the establishment of a genealogy of the metaphysics found in the philosophical work, The Source of Life, Yanbu al-Hayya, known to us mainly under the title of its Latin translation, Fons Vitae. The component which prevents an unequivocal categorization of Ibn Gabirol's metaphysics is the centrality of intelligible matter, which appears within the supreme couple of principles. In the introduction to his Hebrew translation of the excerpts from Ibn Gabirol's Source of Life, Makor Chaim, Shem Tov Falakera points at a certain proximity between the views of Ibn Gabirol and the Book of the Five Substances, Sefer HaAtzamim HaChamisha, attributed to the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles. Falakera writes, I quote, and this is the first quotation on the handout, והנראה לי כי הוא נמשך באותן הדעות אחר דעת הקדמונים מחכמי המחקר, כמו שנזכר בספר שחיבר בנדקלס בעצמים החמישה. And it seems to me that in his views he was drawn after the view of the ancient philosophers, as it is mentioned in the book which composed Empedocles on the five substances. These lines have been often interpreted in scholarship as Falakera's statement of direct dependence of Ibn Gabirol on so-called pseudo-Empedoclean doctrines. The proximity to which Falakera intends relates to the concept of intelligible matter found in Ibn Gabirol's Source of Life, which is expressed in the universal presence of matter and form. The concept of universal presence of matter, and particularly the conceptualization of an intelligible matter, is opposed to the standard Aristotelian view of matter as implying potentiality, having an inferior ontological status, and thus basically belonging to the realm of generation and decay, as Falakera continues in his introduction. Falakera's observation reflected the communality of the sublime ontological status attributed to matter in both Ibn Gabirol's Source of Life and the teachings ascribed to Empedocles in various medieval sources, inter alia in the Book of the Five Substances mentioned by Falakera. The proximity between Ibn Gabirol and doctrines ascribed to Empedocles could be even strengthened in light of the terminological consonance between Ibn Gabirol and the teachings ascribed to Empedocles. The extant Arabic fragments of Ibn Gabirol's source of life render universal matter as unsur, which Falakera, in his Hebrew excerpts, translates with its Hebrew equivalent yesod. Arabic expositions of doctrines ascribed to Empedocles employ the same terminology. The term unsur has been employed in Arabic philosophy to designate element and occasionally also matter, along with the various other terms such as hayula and madda. These points of similarity, made prominent by the statement of Shem Tov Falakera, a medieval scholar who had a good eye for the history of philosophy, have been pivotal for the so-called Pseudo-Empedocles in getting foothold within the research of Jewish philosophy. As an impressive highlight in this career can be named the publishing of the Book of the Five Substances mentioned by Falakera by David Kaufman within his study Pseudo-Empedocles als Quelle Salomon Ibn Gabirols, published together with further studies by Kaufman on Ibn Gabirol under the title Studien über Salomon Ibn Gabirol. In recent scholarship, Sarah Pessin repeatedly emphasized the Pseudo-Empedoclean context of Ibn Gabirol's views and even designated Ibn Gabirol as a Pseudo-Empedoclean philosopher. Meanwhile, a close reading of Falakera's observation in the introduction to his translation does not seem to intend a direct link between Ibn Gabirol and the Pseudo-Empedoclean Book of the Five Substances. Falakera's note rather means that Ibn Gabirol's system is similar to those of the ancient philosophers who pose a concept of intelligible matter. Hereby, Falakera could probably have in mind doxographic expositions of the teachings of pre-Socratic thinkers, or doxographic expositions or remarks by Aristotle, whose references to the problem of matter Falakera himself mentioned in his introduction. An example of such ancient views, Falakera continues, is provided in the Book of the Five Substances, which he obviously himself translated, and therefore this work lent itself as an example which is not far to seek. I will now turn to the context of the so-called Pseudo-Empedocles, to the Neoplatonist pre-Socratics. Following Falakera's observation, we should turn to the teachings of the ancient philosophers, among them Empedocles, accessible in the Middle Ages. The teachings of pre-Socratic thinkers were accessible in Arabic through Aristotle's works and through various doxographies. A systematic Neoplatonic interpretation of the pre-Socratics is preserved in the doxography of Pseudo-Ammonius. The Arabic text of the doxography, accessible to us today, originates in the middle of the 9th century. The main characteristic of the outline of the various systems of thought in the doxography of Pseudo-Ammonius is the basic Neoplatonic mindset of the compiler. The Neoplatonic interpretation of the pre-Socratics here stands in line with Plotinus' attempt to view the pre-Socratic teachings through the prism of his own system. The doxography relies on Greek doxographic material, yet underwent a further reworking in the Neoplatonic circles of the Islamic milieu. It is a compilation which combines a variety of traditions, simultaneously weaving into these synthesized expositions the worldview of the compiler. Striking is here the attribution of negative theology and the metaphysics of the one to the pre-Socratic thinkers. The first existent in the expositions of several early philosophers, though, is designated as unsur, the element or matter, which diverges from the classic Neoplatonic view of the hypostasis of intellect as the first being proceeding from the one. The concept of prime element or matter as the first hypostasis obviously emerged here as a consequence of the harmonization of the notions of the pre-Socratic philosophers with the Neoplatonic worldview. After Aristotle categorized the earliest thinkers as viewing a material element, such as water or air, as arche, this concept of a material element as principle was transposed into the Neoplatonic intelligible realm and became the first existent that constitutes the beginning of emanation. The prime element or matter, al-unsur al-awwal, is situated here at the beginning of creation, preceding the intellect. The concept of the first existence as unsur, reflecting here the double meaning of element and matter, which is apparent from the conceptual context in which it appears, may be thus a consequence of the fusion of the pre-Socratic material element as arche and the concept of Neoplatonic intelligible matter. The most extensive and systematic survey of the views of pre-Socratic sages is found in Shahrastani's Book of Religions and Sects, Kitab al-Milal wal-Nihal. Considerable parts of Shahrastani's doxographic exposition of the pre-Socratics rely on the doxography of Pseudo-Ammonius. Shahrastani's exposition, though, is more extensive and includes further material. Daniel de Smet suggests in his fundamental study on Empedocles Arabus and in a number of further articles that the now extant doxography of Pseudo-Ammonius is an abridged version and that Shahrastani's presentation of the pre-Socratics goes back to the original and more extensive version of Pseudo-Ammonius. The attempt to find the reflection of the concept of the first element or matter is found in the expositions of several early philosophers in this doxography. The most nuanced elaborations on the concept of prime matter or first element are found in the presentations of the teachings of Thales, Anaximenes, and Empedocles. Shahrastani's outline of Thales' philosophy, following Pseudo-Ammonius, contains a quite detailed elaboration of the concept of the first element or prime matter as the first creation, which includes all forms. Thales' view of water as arche is emphasized here to be the origin of the corporal things, being only a corporal reflection of the metaphysics of the first element or prime matter. A very similar instance of the transposition of a pre-Socratic arche into a Neoplatonic key is found in the presentation of the teachings of Anaximenes. In the same way as Thales determined water to be an image of the first element or matter in the corporal realm, Anaximenes regarded air, the first principle, awal al-awail, of the existence of the corporal world, as reflecting the element or matter, which is the first principle, awal al-awail, of the intelligible existence. The quite detailed elaboration on the notion of the first element or matter in the exposition of the teachings of Empedocles seems to be rather a secondary development to the concept of the Neoplatonized arche. Unsur, prime matter or element, is the simplest of all creations, yet as a created substance, it cannot be complete oneness, but is composed of the attributes love and victory, which are the two attributes or forms of matter. Situated in the Neoplatonic context, the originally Empedoclean couple of principles, love and strife, misread in the Arabic tradition as love, mahabba, and victory, ghalaba, is explicitly provided with metaphysical meaning, communion, and opposition. It seems that the concept of unsur as the first hypostasis primarily developed as a Neoplatonic variation of the teachings of such philosophers as Thales and Anaximenes, and was secondarily adapted to the teachings of Empedocles. Finally, an attempt has been made to apply it to further philosophers in the frame of the endeavor of the compiler to render the early philosophers consonant regarding the crucial elements of the system, such as apophatic theology and the first creation. Thus, the doctrine, which in scholarship became famous as Pseudo-Empedoclean, is a common feature of several pre-Socratic thinkers read in the Middle Ages through a Neoplatonic prism. Like Pseudo-Ammonius and Shahrastani's presentations of the teachings of Empedocles, the Hebrew fragments of the Book of the Five Substances represent basically a Neoplatonic composition dealing with subjects of ontology and epistemology and contain the concept of a first existence preceding the hypostasis of intellect and love and strife as two principles of being. I will now turn to Ibn Gabirol against the background of the Neoplatonized pre-Socratics. The concept of the supreme intelligible matter permits to view a certain kinship between Ibn Gabirol's metaphysics and the ontology of the Neoplatonized pre-Socratics, which situates hypostatic matter at the summit of the ladder of being. Yet, despite the common denominator of the sublime ontological status of matter, Ibn Gabirol's concept of intelligible matter and the concept of unsur of the Neoplatonized pre-Socratics differ significantly. While the Neoplatonized pre-Socratics present a clear succession of hypostases, the highest of which is matter, Ibn Gabirol develops a complex metaphysics central to which is the complementarity and union of the two universal substances, matter and form. Constituting the entire reality, they appear as being always related to one another and actually ever unified. Describing the features of matter and form, Ibn Gabirol emphasizes their existence as separate substances, their relatedness, and complementarity. I quote, and this is the third quotation on your handout, ברושם היסוד הכללי הלקוח מסגולותיו הוא שהוא עצם קם בעצמו הנושא לחילוף והוא אחד במספר וירושם עוד שהוא עצם מקבל לכל הצורות. ורושם הצורה הכללית שהיא עצם מקים לעצם כל הצורות ותורשם שהיא עצם החוכמה השלמה והאור הנקי. Translation. The translation is Charles Mannequin's translation, which appears also on your handout. By the way, I use the translation by Shem Tov Falakera, the Hebrew excerpts, because of the exact rendering of the Arabic unsur by Yesod. This distinction we do not have in the Latin translation. So I read the translation, the English translation. The description of the universal matter, taken from its properties, is a self-subsistent substance that supports diversity and is numerically one. It can also be described as a substance that receives all the forms. The description of universal form is a substance that constitutes the substance of all forms. One could also describe it as the substance of perfect wisdom and pure light. End quote. Universal matter is a distinct substance which is a substratum for diversity. Its main feature is receptivity towards forms. Universal form, on its part, is a substance that gives subsistence to the totality of forms, and as perfect wisdom and pure light includes them. The dialectics of unity and distinction of the two universal substances portrays, on the one hand, their mutually independent existence, and on the other hand, their actual unity throughout the ontological ladder. Ibn Gabirol repeatedly states that matter is never found without form, neither in the sensible nor in the intelligible realm. I quote, והצורה הייתה בידיעת הבורא, התברך והתעלה, נפרדת, ואחר כן התרקבה עם היסוד, והיה זה בלא זמן. In the Creator's knowledge, blessed and exalted be He, form is separate and afterwards combines with matter, but this occurs timelessly. The separate existence of form in the divine knowledge and its subsequent unification with matter designate only ontological dimensions rather than a succession of stages. The conjunction of universal matter and form is accomplished at an ontological level beyond time, such that they are unified throughout the layers of the spiritual realm. The tension between these two substances, which do not have anything in common, is resolved by the divine will, which accomplishes the intertwining of these two principles of being through passion as a universal moving force. Ibn Gabirol encourages understanding matter, form, and the will abstracted from each other, Yet, basically, he looks at this complex from various angles, and in fact, each of them is explained in relation to the others. The relation between the will and matter and form is described numerous times from different perspectives, conceptually and through metaphors. The main impression which emerges from these repeated descriptions is the universal presence of matter and form and the universal permeation of reality by divine will. Since the concept of universal matter and form lies at the core of Ibn Gabirol's philosophy and Fons Vitae, various suggestions have been made to identify this concept in Ibn Gabirol's poetry, especially in his seminal poem Keter Malchut. Yet the relation between Ibn Gabirol's metaphysics in Fons Vitae and in his poetic corpus is controversial, and elaborating on it would go beyond the scope of this lecture. At the core of Ibn Gabirol's meticulous analysis of the primacy of matter and form in Fons Vitae lies the classical Neoplatonic problem, the transition from the one to multiplicity. This is the root of the unsatisfactory results for the seeker of an unambiguous, definite scheme of reality. We can observe as Ibn Gabirol seemingly extends the highest principles, stating that throughout the intelligible realm, matter and form are unified, simultaneously positing their separate existence at a level of reality where separate existence should be denied. Matter is said to originate in the first substance, while form is said to originate from the attribute of substance. Though the first substance is absolute unity and duality emerges only at the level of matter and form. I quote, בהיסוד נוכח העצם, כלומר שהוא נברא לו, והצורה נוכח תואר העצם, וארצה לומר החוכמה והאחדות. ואף על פי שאין העצם מתואר בתואר זולתי עצמו. וזה ההפרש בין הפועל והפעול. כי הפועל עצם אחד והפעול הוא שניים עצמים, והם היסוד והצורה. באור זה כי העצם הראשון יתקדש ותוארו אחד על האמיתה, לא ישתנה, אבל היסוד והצורה משתנים, כי הם תכלית רישום האחדות. וארצה לומר בתחילה התחלת הפועל והם ראשון מה שאצלה, כלומר הצילה. Matter corresponds to first substance, I mean that the former is created by latter. Form corresponds to an attribute of substance, I mean wisdom and unity, although, strictly speaking, first substance is not described by an attribute that is other than its essence. That is the difference between the agent and the acted upon. For the agent is one substance, and the acted upon is two substances, namely matter and form. The explanation for this is as follows. First substance, blessed be he, and his attribute are a true unity without any variation. But matter and form are variable, for they are the farthest reach of impression of unity. By farthest reach, I mean the beginning of its action, for they are the first things that follow it. To the statement that matter originates from the first substance, while form proceeds from the attribute of substance, has sometimes been interpreted as the primacy of matter above form, it should be rather understood as matter being the correlate of the first principle, not necessarily situated in a hierarchical succession before form. Ibn Gabirol rather seems to capture here the dynamics as offered by Plotinus, who viewed intelligible matter as closely associated with the initial coming forth of being from the one, and thus with the most sublime layers of the ontological ladder. The detailed inquiry into the 5th chapter of Fons Vitae reveals Ibn Gabirol's main concern regarding his understanding of form and matter. We can indeed undertake various attempts determining the hierarchy of principles, situating them on an imaginary vertical axis. In doing so, we will face certain contradictions. Meanwhile, Ibn Gabirol's main motive is the dynamics of the co-functioning of the supreme principles, while their static portrayal as abiding above or below one another makes rather an impression of a didactic modeling, which necessarily should precede the complex insight into the highest layers of reality. We face here the prominent Neoplatonic difficulty describing the transition from the one to the first being or creation. Already in Plotinus, we observe an attempt to describe this transition as a dynamic process in which the actual borderlines between the principles are blurred. This blurring is accomplished by the employment of metaphors, intertwining them with philosophical terminology and making contradictory statements. It seems that Ibn Gabirol is working here also with the ensemble of Neoplatonic linguistic tools, and on the one hand, contouring a number of concepts necessary to approach the sublime matters, on the other hand, highlighting the dynamic and complex nature of the supreme subject matters, which transcends our thinking in vertical hierarchies. Ibn Gabirol's concept is rather voluminous and multidimensional. To conclude, what could be then the genealogy of Ibn Gabirol's metaphysics? The concept of unsur as the first creation proceeding from the one is obviously not an exclusive characteristic of Pseudo-Empedocles. Moreover, also the broader context of Pseudo-Empedocles, the Neoplatonized pre-Socratics, the opposing prime matter as the first hypostasis, obviously do this out of an exegetical necessity rather than out of metaphysical considerations. The terminological peculiarity, too, seems to be less pivotal than usually assumed, since the use of the term unsur to designate matter goes far beyond Pseudo-Empedocles and Neoplatonized pre-Socratics in general. Considering Ibn Gabirol's concept of universal matter against the background of the clear ontological scheme ascribed to pre-Socratic thinkers clarifies that both their genesis and their methodology do not have much in common. In this context, it is worthwhile referring to Jacques Schlanger's suggestion, establishing the family of doctrines which would be compatible with Ibn Gabirol's thinking, rather than seeking to identify direct dependence and influences. Such an approach removes the causal character distinctive of identifying the direct sources of a thinker. Ibn Gabirol is weaving his theory within the Neoplatonic tradition. It is possible that doxographic expositions, where the schematic representation of the structure of reality provides certain elements such as matter and form with a particular prominence, could stimulate various thinkers, introducing them into a Neoplatonic structure of reality. This also applies to allied doctrines, which convey the concept of the two first substances, matter and form, such as found in Isaac Israeli and the so-called Ibn Hasdai's Neoplatonist. A statement of direct dependence, though, while foregrounding the inherited aspect, could rather obscure the actual intention of the thinker. Thank you.
Next speaker is Ehud Krinis of Gurion University. Ehud studies the interrelations between Jewish and Muslim theology in the Middle Ages. And his talk also will address a question like Tanya's talk. Can Ibn Gabirol's improvement of the moral qualities serves as a replacement and summary of Baḥya ibn Paquda's Duties of the Heart? Subtitle, Revising Yehuda ibn Tibbon Letters to Asher ben Meshullam of Lunel. Ehud, please.
Okay, we'll wait until everyone gets the handout. Actually, this lecture is an excuse for you to present to you a very interesting episode, so which is the episode of Judah Ibn Tibbon. So it's really will be nice if everyone will also see the handout, the epistle itself in its original Hebrew and also in the translation. And I apologize that I cut the call, so hopefully you will understand what I'm saying. Solomon Ibn Gabirol treatise, Improvement of the Moral Qualities, which is actually the only Judeo-Arabic treatise that survived and reached us. And the title in Arabic is Kitab Islah al-Akhlaq. In Hebrew, it's known as Tikkun Midot HaNefesh. And Baḥya's Ibn Paquda's Duties of the Heart, Arabic Al-Hidayah ila Faraid al-Qulub, and Hebrew Chovot HaLevavot or Hadracha al Chovot HaLevavot, Torat Chovot HaLevavot, have sometimes been linked to each other. Both are regarded as the earliest manuals to the genre of Jewish ethical works. In some printed editions, the two works are bound together and published in one volume. From the historical angle, this linkage is substantiated by some biographical facts. Baḥya, who flourished in the second half of the 11th century, was probably a decade or two younger than Ibn Gabirol. They were both members of the Jewish community of Saragossa, where Baḥya served as a judge, Dayan. By all likelihood, Duties of the Heart was composed in a span of several decades in the illustrious Kingdom City, where Ibn Gabirol composed his treatise in 1045. And I heard from Jose recently that he thinks that Saragossa is actually the most important intellectual center in the Al-Andalus. From the literary angle, the affinity between the two works is most notable in the appearance of both of them of almost identical lists of 10 pairs of opposite moral qualities. Yet, while Ibn Gabirol structured his entire treatise around this list of pairs, in Baḥya's work, its use is restricted to one chapter only, the 10th and last chapter of Gate 3. When it comes to the first translation of Judeo-Arabic into Hebrew during the second half of the 12th century, these two works become even more linked, not to say entangled. We can learn about some of the circumstances of this entanglement from a letter of the translator of both works, Judah Ibn Tibbon, wrote sometime between 1161 and 1170. The addressee of this letter is Asher, the son of Ibn Tibbon's patron in Lunel, Meshullam ben Jacob. The translation is by Gad Freudenthal, and also the critical edition of this letter or epistle is also made by Gad Freudenthal. So I'm reading part of this letter, and you can see in English translation, I'm starting from the third paragraph. I have eased upon myself the burden of translation, which I had shown for a reason I mentioned in the preface to my translation of the Gate of Unity of God, which I translated to for your master, your father, the Holy Rabbi. May God protect him from the book of duties of the heart. For recall, you and I were studying that gate in his presence. In the midst of our exchanging, I told you that I had found a small composition. And just to illustrate, this is the modern Hebrew translation of the improvement of moral qualities. So you can see indeed that this is a small composition. A small composition on the improvement of the moral qualities of the soul by the wise philosopher, Rabbi Solomon, son of Rabbi Judah, Ibn Gabirol, may his memory be blessed, which encompass all of the themes discussed in the 9 remaining gates of that book, Duties of the Heart, even adding to them. Its words are spoken appropriately, presented according to the method of wisdom. They rely on scriptures and are grounded in the saying of the sages, the parables of the ancients, and the ethical sayings of the philosophers. He arranged all its chapters along a straight path and attained the goal in brief. Its sayings are refined and its readers like remedies. He filled it with heart's wisdom of precious ethical sayings, of matters that are like pearls. Its words are like sapphires. When you hear this, your soul craved to behold the book and to make out its nature. You said, that is Asher is saying, if we had in our hands that work together with the gate on the unity of God, this would suffice for us as a substitute for the entire book, Duties of the Heart. Not exactly the entire book, but at least gates 2 to 10. It could supplement it and ease the burden of excessive length. We would be better able to commit to memory its words according to the order of its chapters for such things which are long and drawn out, no man can memorize. And at that time, you committed me to translate it for you after I completed the translation of the Gate of the Unity of God. I have now translated it for you as best I could to the utmost of my capabilities. So this is a quotation from the epistle, and interesting maybe if you see the rest of the following part of the letter deals with the rendering of the Arabic poetical quotations in Ibn Gabirol treatise. Ibn Gabirol intended, as he writes there, to replace them as much as possible with equivalent Hebrew stanzas he hoped to find in the poems of Ibn Gabirol, Shmuel HaNagid, and other Jewish poets. But it seems that he never materialized this plan. In these documented exchanges between Judah ibn Tibbon and Asher ben Meshullam, Ibn Tibbon specifies the advantages of Ibn Gabirol's improvement of moral qualities over Baḥya's duties of the heart. According to him, Ibn Gabirol's short work encompasses all the themes discussed in gates 2 to 10 of Baḥya's work and even adds to them. The shorter work can therefore certainly serve as a good summary of the longer one. Taking the cue from Judah ibn Tibbon and relying on his judgment, Asher ben Meshullam comes forward with the suggestion that the translation of the improvement of the moral qualities can serve as a replacement, making redundant the translation of duties of the heart gates 2 to 10. For his part, Judah ibn Tibbon is happy to accept Asher ben Meshullam's suggestions. He proceeded with translating Ibn Gabirol's short work, while leaving aside the translation of the rest of Baḥya's work, beyond the already translated first gate. Yet, the following developments prove that Ibn Tibbon's move, presenting a translation of improvement of the moral qualities instead of completing his translation of duties of the heart, did not satisfy the desires of the leading figures of the Jewish community in Provence. Asher's father, Meshullam ben Jacob, the leader of the Lunel community, soon commissioned the grammarian and commentator Joseph Kimchi to translate gates 2 to 10 of duties of the heart. Upon completing this task, Kimchi went on and translated gate 1 of duties of the heart on unity, already translated by Ibn Tibbon. Ibn Tibbon, in his turn, was commissioned by another provincial leader, Abraham ben David of Busquer, to produce his version of duties of the heart gates 2 to 10. So it happened that the sequence of events unfolding in Provence in the 20 to 30 years starting from 1160, not one, but 2 complete translations of duties of the heart were produced. Furthermore, some years later, a grandson of Meshullam ben Jacob and a nephew of Asher, identified by scholars as Asher ben Shelamyah, produced the first known abridgment or summary of duties of the heart, basing himself on Ibn Tibbon's complete translation. Thus, within few decades after it was envisioned and actualized by its 2 proponents, the plan to designate the translation of the improvement of the moral qualities as a summary and replacement of duties of the heart gates 2 and 10 collapsed and failed. From the point of view of the Jewish readership, this failure has been a blessing, as it put in their disposal the Hebrew rendition of both works. On the face of it, treating the translation of improvement of the moral qualities as a summary or even a replacement of duties of the heart gates 2 to 10 may seem like a good idea. After all, both works seem to belong to the same genre, and Ibn Gabirol's work is about 9 times shorter than Baḥya's work. But if one probes into the content and the background of the 2 works, it becomes clear why Judah and Asher ben Meshullam plan was doomed to failure. I want to briefly point out here the essential differences between the improvement of the moral qualities and duties of the heart, differences that set the 2 works apart. These essential differences are best demonstrated by juxtaposing the work's most basic terms. Ibn Gabirol's moral qualities, akhlaq, and Baḥya's duties of the heart, faraid al-qulub. Moral qualities are ideal civic virtues such as modesty, love, compassion, joy, tranquility, penitence, goodwill, generosity, and valor. The gradual accusation of moral qualities is a process of self cultivation and improvement and refinement of one's character. By adhering to this process, the individual may obtain the higher civic standards and elevate himself to the status of an exemplary model within his society. In comparison, duties of the heart are one's positive inner qualities, known only to him and to the all-knowing God. Such are the qualities of reliance upon God, sincerity in the worship of God's sake, humility before God, repentance, self-reckoning, and renunciation of this world, and the love of God. These and similar qualities should remain hidden. Their exposure to the public eye exposes them to the danger of being corrupted by the negative inner qualities such as hypocrisy, arrogance, and self-deception. In Ibn Gabirol's ethical system, acquiring the moral qualities as civic virtues and refinement of the character serve as a preparatory level for the achievement of the higher level of human perfection. This perfection is achieved by the refinement of one intellectual through the studying of the theoretical sciences, the sciences that are the subject of Ibn Gabirol work, Fons Vitae, Arabic, Yanbu al-Haya, or maybe Ma'adan al-Haya, as suggested by Eliezer. By contrast, in Baḥya's ethical system, the duties of the heart serve as the direct means for the attainment of the highest human goal, that of intimate proximity to God. In general, the works of Ibn Gabirol and Baḥya attest to two distinctive ethical systems: anthropocentric ethics and theocentric ethics. The subject of Ibn Gabirol's anthropocentric ethics is the individual human being, and the focus is on the individual's conduct within society. The subject of Baḥya's theocentric ethics is the individual believer and his contact vis-a-vis God as his ever-active observer. Ibn Gabirol's anthropocentric ethics draws from the classic philosophical scientific tradition and its reception and adaptation in the Islamicate culture. The major classical sources of this tradition were two. First, Aristotle's Ethics, with its emphasis on the achievement of the golden mean between the two extremes of excess and deficiency in each of the civic virtues. And the second, Hippocrates and Galen's medical doctrines, which seeks physical balance within the system of the four humors. In contradistinctions, Baḥya's theocentric ethics relies mainly on the values of the Muslim ascetic Zuhd tradition, and especially on the transformation of the Zuhd tradition into a psychological system of self-examination in the writing of Al-Kharis al-Muhasabi, who was mentioned, of course, at Omer's lecture earlier. As already mentioned, Ibn Gabirol and Baḥya lived roughly on the same time, worked in the same place, belonged to the same milieu. Given this social and intellectual proximity between them, the fact that these two writers produce ethical works so different in their basic approach and historical background is illuminating. It testifies to the vitality and diversity of the Islamicate culture in Al-Andalus in general, and in the Jewish Andalusian subculture in particular. Ibn Gabirol was probably the first to provide the readers of Judeo-Arabic with a manual belonging to the philosophical scientific tradition, which was already well established in the Islamic world by his time. In the realm of Judeo-Arabic literature, Ibn Gabirol's pioneering effort was eclipsed in the following century by Maimonides. By the same time, Judah ibn Tibbon produced his translation to the improvement of the moral qualities, Maimonides was working on his commentary on the Mishnah. This great endeavor included the presentation of the philosophical scientific ethics as part of the introduction to his commentary to Tractate Avot, better known under the title 8 Chapters. A few years later, Maimonides included even more authoritative and well-known version of this kind of ethics in the section Laws of Personal Development, Hilchot De'ot, of his great halachic code. Baḥya's lengthy presentation of the inner aesthetic theocentric ethics was never eclipsed during the heydays of the Judeo-Arabic culture, and possibly never since. Gniza fragments contain evidence of the popularity of duties of the heart already in its original Judeo-Arabic version. It retained and increased its popularity through the ages with the dissemination of the Hebrew version. Even though the improvement of the moral qualities was written somewhat earlier, it was duties of the heart that was destined to be regarded as the foundational work of post-biblical and post-Talmudic Jewish ethics. From a long-term perspective, the failure of Ibn Tibbon and Asher ben Meshullam's plan can be regarded as emblematic. Notwithstanding the contribution of Ibn Gabirol and Maimonides, it is Baḥya and the theocentric ethics that prevailed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ehud. And our last speaker is Lucas Hershtein from the University of York. And he will speak about Ibn Gabirol's Metaphysics of Relation.
Thank you. So I have been reading many of you, those who are here and there, for the last 10 years, so it's like a huge honor for me to be here. When I sent my abstract for this conference, then the first reply I got was something like a what? Because I know that I'm doing something different. I work at the Department of Philosophy of the University of York. So one of the things the organizers told me was to kind of introduce what I'm going to do here, what I'm trying to do with Ibn Gabirol and with his text. So this is a summary of the the essay I'm working on. I will read a summary of both sections, like a summary of the first one, in which I'm trying to present, as I said, what I'm trying to do with Ibn Gabirol, and also a summary of the second one, in which I'm dealing with the font of life. Like I have many texts in the. I'm very bad at making handouts and that kind of stuff. How do I? As it has been said, a medieval philosophical text can be approached through different prisms based on the aim of working on a doxography, a historical reconstruction, a rational reconstruction, or a Geistesgeschichte. This division is methodological. When working on a text, a reader's aims are also the lenses through which the text itself is read. However, this division is also ontological. The idea that the history of philosophy can have a properly philosophical and not only a historical value relies on the assumption that a text can be read not only focusing on what did it mean, but also on what does it mean. If this is the case, there seems to be a difference between a text meaning, which refers to the whole verbal meaning of a text, and its significance, which refers to textual meaning in relation to a larger context, like, for example, another mind, another era, a wider subject matter, an alien system of values, and so on. In other words, significance is textual meaning as related to some context, indeed any context beyond itself. The text meaning can be defined as a solution its author gives to the problem motivating the writing. The text significance is a problem itself. Based on this division, it can be argued that there are sharing philosophical problems that ought to be addressed in their own right. Of course, from other positions, there might be said that there are not philosophical problems like Wittgenstein, etc., but I'm not dealing with that right now. Suppose the significance of a text is reduced to its meaning. In that case, the history of philosophy as an academic field can only be ascribed either an instrumental value, claiming that both thinkers had wrong answers but can still be helpful to figure out correct ones, or an intrinsic one, pleading that they got the right solutions. Oppositely, by assuming an iterative relationship between meaning and significance, it can be argued that philosophical problems are unsolvable. This way, the history of philosophy would not be a scrutiny of the responses given to particular dilemmas, but a dialogue with these problems themselves. Medieval philosophy would be important then, quoting somewhere here, not because it leads to philosophical truth, but because it leads to philosophical questions, end of the quotation. A text's actual meaning may be found in the 11th century. However, its potential universe of significance exists in a trans-temporal dimension where the text authors are somehow co-present with their readers. It is a liminal zone of practical concern between the past and the present. Can you read that? No, okay. So the font of life, the answer given by Ibn Gabirol to the philosophical problems he was puzzled by, was written in the 11th century. Considering the argumentative context and intellectual background is essential to understand an argument. As an example, it will not be intellectually fruitful to force a text which relies on a dialectic theory of truth to offer reasons for its claims following classical logic, or to ask for conceptual precision from authors who believe it was methodologically proper to put forward certain arguments, even if they were still in the process of being developed. However, the problem can be seen as being brought to light now, or today, let's say. Of course, any philosophical understanding presupposes the background of an interpreted tradition. A conscious process of conceptual translation is also done in the light of an underlying intellectual translation, because of which certain translation tools and vocabulary are chosen instead of others. And this movement can continue forevermore. Therefore, it can be said that the point at which this process becomes conscious is where the conceptual translation begins. Before that, the philosopher is not a translator, but rather being translated by his own unrecognized biases. Nevertheless, the history of philosophy is a philosophical venture because of its embrace of a deliberate conscious process of conceptual translation, which is assumed to be needed for the meaning to become significant, and therefore for the significance to reveal the meaning. As it has been argued, and this is the quotation that you have here, there is indeed a sense in which we can understand what a philosopher says in his own terms before relating his thought to ours. But this minimal sort of understanding is like being able to change courtesies in a foreign tongue without being able to translate what one is saying into our native language. Translation, or conceptual translation, is necessary if understanding is to mean something more than engaging in rituals of which we do not see the point, and translating an utterance means fitting it into our practices. At the same time, there usually is, in the world of analytic philosophy, a positivist understanding of truth underlying the claim that when focusing on texts written in the past, one should be doing philosophy and not history of ideas. Nevertheless, if the idea, the idea that analytic philosophers have of philosophical truth is relativized, the two-sided process by which on the text meaning is discovered through a significance, and B, the significance becomes its meaning, can be repeated indefinitely. That repetition becomes, in fact, the text itself. The so-called original meaning of text is irretrievably lost. The difference between a text meaning and a significance is not in the text, and therefore significance are not in themselves. Consequently, there are as many significances of a text as there are dialectical contexts in which it can be placed, but none of them is by itself closer to the truth. Therefore, they often demand a division of labor, like, for example, by Werthmann, between historians and philosophers when working on medieval texts, or philosophical medieval texts, becomes irrelevant in itself because they simply represent different interplays of mythos, logos, and historia. So now, to Ibn Gabirol. The three questions of the font of life. I see Ibn Gabirol as dealing with three philosophical questions in his extant philosophical text. First, what entities exist? Second, what these entities are or how they exist? And last, what does it mean for these entities to be or to exist? The first two questions are intertwined. It will not be possible to say that there is a book on my table without assuming that there is a book here. However, to say that there is a book, I must have previously assumed what a book is. Even if I only say that there is something there without specifying what that is, I have assumed an idea of what it means to be something instead of not being so. The third question refers to what it means for these entities that are this or that and that are not this or that to be. It has been said that the font of life deals only with the question of what entities exist by drafting an inventory of the universe, and not with the problem of explaining what they are by specifying the ultimate nature of the items included in that catalog. Like, for example, Vicente Cantarino argues that the font of life does not deal with the basic metaphysical question, what does exist, rather with the essential problem of the philosophical system of Ibn Gabirol is the analysis of that which exists. And therefore, he doesn't offer a so-called theory of being, but of being with capital letter. Of the possible methods Ibn Gabirol could have chosen, he does not begin with a dialectical analysis of the very notion of being with capital letter, but he places in the foreground the reality of the existing being. So, however, the first of the three above mentioned questions is answered in the text by pointing out the particulars that instantiate ontologically preceding universals, which they partially affirm and partially negate, all the way up until the universal of universals, the so-called intellect, which contains everything its reality as its own reality, and all the way down until the particular, which is not a universal for anything else. The second question is answered in the text by pointing out the universals that are instantiated, since each particular is, and at the same time is not universal that expresses. In sum, in the text, the question of what entities exist is the question of what these entities are, because every level of reality is a relative expression of something else, which ontologically precedes up to the universal of universals, in which everything that is encompassed and exists being that same universal. In this essay, I mean, in the whole essay, not only this presentation, I have two goals. First, to propose a new reading of the second question, what is that what is, which I see as encompassing the first one, what it is. My second goal is to see if an answer for the first interrogation, what it means to be for that what is, can be meaningful, derived in the font of life. The answer to the first two questions has been read from, I believe, from different perspectives. Let's say two perspectives of Lunel, the article on the book, Schlanger, and Sarah Pessin. Although different in their understanding of the font of life, they share a similar interpretative framework, which I think it may be summarized in two main points. The first one is like they all share a monadic ontology, and the second one, they all share a subject-predicate logic. Ibn Gabirol does not discuss the topic of relations in the font of life. Furthermore, there are no indications that he saw this as a philosophical problem. However, there is an, albeit implicit, problem of relations in the text. Even further, a redefinition of what Ibn Gabirol understands as the relations of existence may help find a new interpretative key of the text, breaking away from the Aristotelian-minded readings that have dominated until now. The debate on the nature of relations throughout the Middle Ages involved multiple metaphysical and theological variables, most of which were in fact completely alien to Ibn Gabirol. As it is known, Aristotle discusses relations, or rather relatives in Greek, in the physics 5, in the metaphysics also 5, and in categories 7, 12, and 13. It might be said that there is a problem in, I know that since I'm not trying to do like exactly history of philosophy, I'm not quoting texts that Ibn Gabirol, I believe, he read, but I'm quoting texts that I believe dominate actually still the interpretations that are given of Ibn Gabirol. So Aristotle defines relations as one of the 9 classes, whether he understands them as words, concepts, or things that, contrary to the substance, depend for their existence on that in which they inhere. Relations are seen as ontologically dependent on the substances that are related to each other, because there is nothing else in reality beyond these substances and their accidents. These substances are related because of the accident of relation, which is sometimes defined as an accident and sometimes is reduced to one of the other 8 categories. Furthermore, in both cases, the accident because of which 2 substances are related is sometimes mentioned as a pair of accidents, the first of which inheres in one of the substances and the second in the other one, like in category 7, and sometimes as a single accident, like in metaphysics 5. Substances are beyond the accidents that modify them. Since relations are nothing by accidents, when substances enter relationships, they do not gain or lose anything in themselves. When discussing causation, Aristotle introduces the idea of things, most probably here words as concepts, not beings, that are what they are in relation to something different from themselves. However, there is no actual ontological relationship between them. The relation between them is one of logical implication. In the example given by him, which is also the same example that is reproduced by Maimonides in his short treatise on logic, probably reading Farabi and not Aristotle himself, as far as I can recall. the relation between them is one of logical implication. In the example given by him, Aristotle, and also Maimonides, neither the double generates the half nor the opposite, but the same notion of double implies that one of the half. Categories 12. So, like, I just put the text in Greek and Arabic, but in the font of life, there are now going to the text itself. In the font of life, there are, I believe, ontological and logical relations. It is very well known that mainly one of the main reasons why Gabirol was kind of well known in the Middle Ages is because he was very strongly criticized because of what it was seen as like a projection of logical categories into the ontological realm. That is the understanding of reality based on the understanding of the own process of his own mind. I don't believe this is the case, and this is one of the reasons why I think that making this difference or pointing out the difference between the logical and the ontological realms in Ibn Gabirol can help us understand new dimensions of the text. So as I was saying, in the font of life, there are ontological and logical relations. Loosely speaking, the primary logical relation is implication. The font of life has been seen as projecting, as I was saying, logical categories into the ontological realm, both by its medieval and contemporary readers. However, logical categories are for Gabirol both abstractions of the relations he finds in the ontological order and, at the same time, analytic tools. Consequently, I will focus only on ontological relations. The central ontological relation is causation, but its meaning is deeper than usually understood. The text says, and this is one of the text says that in being, or in esse, there are only three things: matter and form, essence, and will. So the term voluntas or razón has been translated in a different way by Sarah Pessin, but since I'm mostly dealing just with ontology here, I will just say will. So the text says that in being, there are these three big things, and at the same time, it says that there is a universal being, an expression that I only found in the Latin, not in the Hebrew or the Arabic, like an esse universalis. It is difficult to understand that being can be univocally predicated of the divine principle and the created reality. The text says that everything that is, although it seems to be different things, is united and bound together in being. This may be understood as saying that the property of being cannot be predicated of an individual or a universal, but only of a relation. Consequently, the God of which being can be predicated, the God that is in a relation, whether with itself as essence, with the word in itself, meaning like God, as will, or with the word in the word as matter and form. This is I believe, how the idea that like literally, I'm quoting here Gabirol, the idea that non-being cannot be matter of being should be read. Meaning the dimension of the divine principle that is beyond being cannot interact in any way with being, contrary to the dimension which is, in fact, in the same relation. There might be a divine principle which, lacking the property of being, is beyond any relation, even with itself, but it will be impossible to know it within the framework of the font of life, since in the text there is a very clear and explicit correspondence between the orders of being and knowledge. To know something means to grasp it, and to grasp it is to comprise it and surround it. Or in more simple words, to know something means to be something, and to be something means to know something. The organicity of this chain of being as an entity is alluded, I believe, by referring to it as an everything and a body. At the same time, ontological hierarchy is highlighted by saying that some levels of reality are an example of others. There is continuity between the different levels, but the relation between them is dynamic. Reality is constantly becoming something different from what it is or from what it was. as we can see, for example, quotation number 12. Everything belongs to the same chain. This is referred in Latin, for example, with the word contingo, because it converges convenio in being, and it reduplicates itself like in a succession, although not a linear one, of mirrors. The text says that there is an explicit relationship between creation and movement. This idea of continuity may suggest that reality is a ceaselessness substance that linearly becomes one or another thing. But the text may also be read as arguing something different. That is, that everything meets primarily in being and secondarily in being in a certain way. The order of being is an order of subsistence. Everything subsists in something else. However, everything first subsists in the esse universalis, which is not an esse, but the act of being itself, pure movement of becoming. In fact, the text says that there is not only substance and accidents, but explicitly, this is what Ibn Gabirol says, there also is beyond substance and accidents, movement and whiz. This whiz underlies the substantial order of reality. It goes beyond the division between substance and accident. If this is the case, it cannot be precisely a substance. And the latter, and the better candidate, sorry, considering what it is said in other fragments of the text, is being itself. The text says that the essence of something is not that thing itself. Moreover, the term properties is mentioned in numerous occasions using certain vocabulary that seems to imply that there are essential properties understood as the characteristics. I mean, this is the way in which I understand essential properties, the characteristics of the natural kind to which a particular entity belongs. They could be understood as the unique properties of which Aristotle talks in the Topics 1. In the case of matter, these properties are to be, or to exist, to be one, to exist in itself, and to give its substantiality, both in ontological and logical terms, to that other reality that is sustained on it. The text says that the essence of matter is not different from the essence of existing things. If this is understood as an ontological and not only a logical definition, it means that the essence of whatever exists is not that thing itself. In the case of a form, the properties are to subsist, meaning to exist in another being, making that what exists in fact to exist and completing it. This seems puzzling. If matter exists and form subsists, I shall got lost with the quotation, sorry. If matter exists and form subsists, the ontological hierarchy between them is clear. However, at the same time, the form gives its being to everything what exists. In other words, the form, which needs an extra esse to exist or to subsist, gives what it does not hold its esse. The classical solution to this dilemma has been to argue that matter refers to an esse in potentia and form to an esse in effectu. However, this ignores some of the references to being itself that can be found in the text. Furthermore, it is said that there has to be a subject underlying contraries, because otherwise the order of substantiality will be ontologically secondary. However, it is constantly denied in the text that there could be one all-comprehensive reality. It will be possible to make sense of both theses, the one saying that everything is two and the one saying that everything is one, by assuming that what is not substance is ontologically prior to the order of substantiality and accidentality. This is, I believe, the esse universalis, the movement that has already been mentioned, a relationship between matter and form in which matter and form are names for positions in a structure which does not exist in itself. The essence of matter and form is their same existence, and this is why the text somewhere there says that there are four modes, like modes or minim. There are four modes of matter and form. They are modes of being of something else, being itself. They are modes of the same being, and they are, and not only are what they are in relation to each other. Everything is simultaneously in esse. Everything participates of being, but there is no being to be participated of beyond the same moment of participation. It is said that if something is one thing, it cannot be divided. Matter and form, or what they point out to, are somehow divided. Since the esse universalis seems not to be divided, it can be concluded that as far as they are the same thing, which is not the thing, but the relation. The essential properties of matter and form are not intrinsic properties, understanding them as those properties that an entity possesses independently of everything else that exists, or independently of whether anything else exists, so that the property of being, the only existing being, the only existing entity, does not come out as intrinsic. What counts as intrinsic is determined by the causal structure of the world. There are no self-identical entities in the font of life. In the matter, matter and form are nothing but names for the ultimate relation structure of the world to sustain or to be sustained. I'm coming to the end, I promise. Matter is the first-degree relation of the divine principle, which itself. Form is a second-degree relation of the divine principle, which itself. They are not univocal but equivocal names whose purpose is to emphasize that everything that is and is what it is in relation to something else. Or, in the terms of the text, everything sustains or it is sustained. In the end, matter and form are nothing but names for the ultimate relation structure of the world. The principle of individuation is not the intrinsic properties, but the position in the structure of relations. Relations are not reduced to substances. On the contrary, substances are moments in the matter-form structure created by their own relationship. Or in other words, relata do not precede relations. Ibn Gabirol argues that knowledge is constricted by being. As I said before, one grabs when actually this verb is different in Latin than in Arabic. It means different things. One grabs what it is. If there is a relational ontology, as I believe there is, then there cannot be but a relational epistemology. This is said explicitly by Ibn Gabirol when it is argued that knowledge operates by means of comparison. However, it also carries a deeper meaning. The correlative epistemology of relational ontology is not only relational but also relativistic. This does not necessarily mean epistemic realism. One can only know through the matter and form relational structure of the world, so knowledge is always relative to, but there is not an ontological structure going beyond this. To conclude, to the question of what entities exist, Ibn Gabirol answers by offering a representation of reality as divided in simultaneously subsequent and simultaneous ontological levels. To the question of what they are, Gabirol replies that they ultimately are matter and form, not because they can be reduced to a pair of universal substances usually understood to be the universal matter and universal form, but because matter and form are the names for the two monads that in a subject predicate Aristotelian logic enter relationship, that is to sustain or to be sustained. However, everything, consequently, everything is in a relation. To the question of what means to be, Ibn Gabirol can be read as saying that being, the ultimate reality to which everything from God to the poorest entity, he says, the rock, is the fact that everything is in a relation. That is, the universal being should not be substantially reduced to the whiz or to the movement, the references by which Gabirol points out the intrinsic connection between everything that exists, neither should be understood as a substance that has the property of being. In Ibn Gabirol, being is the last expression of reality without being the property of anything else, including itself. Not only everything is in a relation, but everything is a relation. Or in other words, relations are everything. That's it.
Thank you very much, Lucas. And now the floor is open. We have 15 minutes for discussion. And you can maybe I'll start with a question to Tanya. My question is about the term intelligible matter. It features in Aristotle in the context of his mathematical ontology as the method that gives geometrical objects their extension. And in the Neoplatonics, Greek Neoplatonics sources that I know, I didn't find the term intelligible matter as a term for prime matter. The terms I know are prime matter or unqualified matter. So from where this idea that this prime matter is intelligible matter comes from?
Yeah, thank you very much for this important question. I unfortunately did not have the space to elaborate on this and also to talk about this very important term, but thank you very much for your question. Yes, we actually have this concept of Lunel in Plotinus. And Plotinus really elaborates on these two types of matter, the matter of the sensible world and the matter of the intelligible world. And like also the argumentation there is the way that in the same way as we have a substrate for diversity in the corporal world, we should have something similar in the intelligible world, which is basically the substrate which enables this diversity of forms. So we indeed have this term, which is Hülenöte and Plotinus, and it first of all figures in this Enad, which he especially dedicates to these two types of matter, the matter of the sensible world and the matter of the intelligible world. And basically, we see that Plotinus views this first phase of the emergence of the intellect as closely related to this concept of intelligible matter. We usually have in mind when we think of Plotinus that there is a succession of hypostases. The intellect comes after the one, then we have the soul. But basically, when we look how Plotinus describes this transition from the one to the intellect, we see that there are basically several concepts and several moments of this emergence of the intellect. And one of these moments, the first moment of the emergence of the intellect, is something undetermined, which basically is the root of what we afterwards call matter. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I hijacked the mic. Toda rabba. Thank you for all three presentations. I have one question to Ehud and one to Tanya. I'll do that briefly. So basically, as you've pointed, there are stark differences between Ibn Gabirol's Tikkun Midot HaNefesh and Baḥya ibn Paquda's work, which for some reason Yehuda ibn Tibbon seems either not to see or not wanting to see or deciding to overcome these similarities. And I'm wondering, how do you see it? I mean, what made him look at them as similar to begin with, given that we are not that far in time from the very writings of, at least of Ibn Paquda, and it seems that when Ibn Tibbon's looking back at Ibn Paquda, it seems worlds apart from it and from understanding what Baḥya is up to. So I'm wondering, what do you think of it? And just very briefly to Tanya, you've presented the very interesting concept or compound of the Neoplatonized pre-Socratics, and I'm wondering, at what level do you see it as a significant category? Is it on the level of the kind of history of philosophy as even an academic discipline, is looking at how kind of the pre-Socratics were presented and represented and reworked, etc.? Or do you see it as significant from the point of view of the medieval authors themselves, that they were looking for understanding specifically what the pre-Socratics or what the ancient philosopher before were all about? The question is clear?
Yeah,
okay. Okay.
Okay, so I assume, I think that actually Yehuda ibn Tibbon was much closer to the philosophical scientific tradition, and while he was translating the first gate of duties of the heart, so this is the most philosophical. This is the the philosophical part of this work. So it wasn't a problem for him, you know, to present it to the community of Lunel, but he's coming from Al-Andalus as a kind of a representative, as he may have seen, I think, that of this more sober philosophical scientific tradition. And here he didn't, I think that he was reluctant to expose this community, Lunel, you know, to the other side, at least at the beginning, you know. It's much more complex because I think that's why he preferred actually that the translation of a work which is belonging to this kind of tradition, the more rationalistic philosophical one. But we need to remember that in a few years ahead, he translated the Kuzari of Judah Halevi, which is a kind of, in a way, also something which is outside this tradition. So I think that you can see the dynamic between what he wants and between what his patrons want, you know. So this is why this document is so interesting, because you can feel the dynamic, because he's pushing to one ways and his patrons pushing to this in this episode to the same way, but actually in reality also for the opposite way.
Thank you, Omer, for your question regarding the Neoplatonized pre-Socratics. Basically, the Neoplatonized pre-Socratics are part of the doxographic activity. And this is a very important point, because we many times think about medieval philosophy as the product of certain thinkers who somehow transfer to us their concepts and so on. And it is very important to see, I think, that beyond these philosophical works that we have and that we probably usually have in mind when we think about medieval philosophy, we don't think about the diversity of this philosophical activity. And I think that doxographies are here a very interesting area where we not only have this transmission of the ideas of the certain ancient thinkers, like, for example, in the case of the pre-Socratics, because we do not have their works, and like at all, like throughout the history of philosophy, they have been mainly transmitted through doxographies. And we see that that beyond this fact of transmission, we also have some point of a very interesting development of concepts through doxographic activity. Like in the case of these same Neoplatonized pre-Socratics, we see here the reading of these pre-Socratic thinkers through a Neoplatonic prism, and we see how through this interpretative approach, a new concept is born, like a new concept, like this first hypothesis as matter. So we basically see that this endeavor to somehow create a unified history of philosophy, where most important thinkers more or less have taught the same, and this is what we have. For instance, in the same doxography of Pseudo-Ammonius, we have this statement that basically these ancient thinkers, it is maybe not always clear who exactly is meant, who exactly is on the list, but we have the statement that they basically had some insight of truth, and this is why we also have a correspondence between their concepts. And of course, this correspondence is created, and while creating this correspondence, the compiler is basically developing new concepts. The concepts, these new concepts are basically products of an interpretation of earlier philosophers. So I think it is not only something which we should look at in the frame of the history of philosophy, and that maybe the thinkers whom we are studying, like Ibn Gabirol, were reading such doxographies. Of course they were. Of course they were. Like, maybe we do not always have the possibility to say which thinker read which doxographies, but we should be aware of the fact that these histories of philosophy were available and were of course read, and were part of the curriculum in the philosophical education of the medieval thinkers. Thank you.
So first, thank you. You can hear me fine. There you go. So first, thank you all for the very stimulating panel. I feel most qualified to ask any of the questions. My question is very much along the same line as Omer. And so from our vantage point, we're always struck by the great differences that exist between medieval Jewish works, right? Be it these two, be it Halevi and Maimonides, be it Abraham and Ezra and Maimonides. And when we always look at the readers who are closest to them in time, they tend to read them in a complementary manner. Right? So the super commentaries on Abraham and Ezra largely synthesize this thought with Maimonides, despite the fact that they were so vastly opposed to one another in so many ways. So for me, it raises the question, why do Tibbon is creating these linkages between works, and it seems that whereas Maimonides himself would have been very happy to, like Tanja and Halevi mentioned, or insult Joseph, it was like, there's different projects here, which seems to be the creation of a library of Judeo-Arabic thought, right? That's going to have an audience in Lunel. So I'm wondering if you feel the creation of those links have to do with that kind of project. And then secondly, related to it, I'm struck that the line where he's praising Ibn Gabirol, and he says, he relies on scripture, the sayings of the sages, the parable of the ancients, the ethical sayings of the philosophers. Might he have been between the lines saying something about Baḥya's sources? Maybe he thinks all this reliance on Sufi stories and I believe them saying for Ali and so on. Maybe there was some sort of discomfort that he thought might not land well with the audience now. Maybe that was just a bridge too far.
Yeah. Actually, you pointed to a very important point because it's very hard to translate Baḥya, actually, and Baḥya language is perhaps the most difficult language of any Judeo-Arabic, I mean, prosaic work. And even Tibbon, as it came, as we said, he first translated the first book, and then he translated the other parts. And so we have two introductions to, and he complained, I need to work so hard, and fight with this language. So this is maybe enough, it's not only much shorter, it's easier to translate for him. So this is another good point for why actually preferring the Ibn Gabirol's work on Baḥya's work as well. And we have to remember that we're here on a crossroad, of a historical crossroad. This is, this letter is belonging, to the very start of the transmission of knowledge from an Andalus and Judeo-Arabic culture to Europe. So if we look ahead to the following 200 or 300 years, so we see that not so much Judah ibn Tibbon, but the later translations, the translator, with some of them were his descendants, were focusing, they're focusing on the philosophical course, when coming, because they also not only translated from Judeo-Arabic, this translated from Muslim work as well. But what they choose they choose the more philosophical rationalistic works, and they preferred this kind of work to expose the readers in the Jewish European world to this kind of works. And so looking ahead, we can see that this is also pointing to the following, that the preference of this tradition or this legacy or the rationalistic philosophical over the other options that either Judeo-Arabic or the general Muslim world has to offer, Islamicate world, let's say. So this is, so the nickname of Judah Ibn Tibbon is the father of translators. So he is actually pointing to the future in this preference as well.